has a
Elito, mute. There you go. Okay, so pen and paper. We're going to draw the basal ganglia. I actually really enjoy this. I don't draw very well, but I like to understand things. And if I'm going to understand it, I need to draw it. And so if you come into my office, you'll see that we like to write on windows. We like to draw things out as we're explaining things to patients. And so this is just a good functional diagram of the basal ganglia. And I hope the practitioners will really enjoy this. I hope that, caregivers will glean something from this. But here's the thing, I want to really help break this down and make it more understandable. Okay, so here's what you do. You first draw the cortex. Now we have the direct and the indirect pathway outlined here, and I have that noted here by direct and indirect. And what Dr. D'Onofrio always taught me is that, Crawford, you have to think about it this way. Direct flights, they're shorter and there's less things that'll go wrong. Indirect flights, or I'm sorry, connecting flights, that's your indirect pathway. Okay, so your direct flights, they're shorter, there's less things that go wrong. Okay, and that's true of your direct pathway here. And so let's talk about that one first. So the cortex will fire down to the striatum. Okay, now also something to note about the striatum. This is where the substantia nigra pars compacta will come in and feed dopamine into the striatum. Boom. Okay, the striatum then will inhibit the globus pallidus internus. This will then inhibit the thalamus and excite the cortex to promote movement. All right, and so the direct pathway, again, connected more to D1 receptors like we talked about earlier. So you can write a D1 under here. This promotes movement. All right, this is getting you up, getting you going, getting you motivated, whether it's your thought, your motor control, your whatever it is, right? Now, here's a trick. How do you know excitation, inhibition, Crawford? You're throwing me for a loop here. You're increasing my stress response, and this is not cool. I don't like you. I'm not going to poke you on Facebook. But here's the thing, okay? Here's a trick. If you draw this like this, you can write plus, minus, minus, plus, and now watch this. Plus, minus, minus, plus, and it all makes sense. So let me do that again. All right, you go cortex, striatum, globus pallidus internus, thalamus, and then we'll talk about the indirect next. We have the globus pallidus externus, subthalamic nucleus, and it goes like this: plus, minus, minus, plus, and then let's go plus, minus, minus, plus. Okay, and that's how you're going to know excitation or inhibition within the basal ganglia. Okay, now you just took a very complicated concept and a lot of test questions if you're going to be taking a fellowship exam. And now you know if the striatum inhibits the globus pallidus externus or excites it. Okay, pretty cool, right? Okay, so that's my little cheat sheet for the basal ganglia there. All right, so that's your direct pathway, again, promotes movement. And then we have our indirect pathway down here. It's a little more complicated, it's a little longer, like our connecting flights. Okay, so in the indirect pathway from the striatum, we fire down here and inhibit the globus pallidus externus. We then fire over into the subthalamic nucleus. We inhibit there, which gives way to excitation of the globus pallidus internus, and then boom, boom, into the cortex. And so here, right, some things to note about the subthalamic nucleus and the globus pallidus internus, just as a side note, is that this is where a lot of deep brain stimulators are actually placed. And they're placed here because these are big relay stations, again, into the thalamus. And so you'll see the GPI is a big target for deep brain stimulators. The subthalamic nucleus is a big target for deep brain stimulators, and so on, right? So that's my little cheat sheet for the basal ganglia, direct, indirect pathway. And so indirect pathway, again, these are your D2 receptors. Indirect pathway is slowing, stopping, modulating motor control, movements, thought processes, and all those things, right? Now, there's even some thought going on about, there's some interplay in with the immune system with this too. I'm not going to get into that currently. Now, here's the cool thing. From the cortex, we have this hyperdirect pathway, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. It's going to fire directly into the subthalamic nucleus, right? Now, the cool thing about the hyperdirect pathway is it's faster and more efficient than the indirect pathway. It's actually faster and more efficient than the direct pathway as well. And whenever we see consistencies in brains like this, I think that it gives rise, and we need to note that perhaps that's telling us that inhibition is very important for us to survive as a species. And so we have two pathways dedicated to inhibition. We have two pathways dedicated to control. We have two pathways dedicated to telling us to let's slow down and think about this. Let's maybe not just go whack that person in the face because they looked at me wrong. Let's maybe not just shut down and freeze because of a memory that isn't actually true, but I kind of think that way because I saw a flash of light. I don't really know I saw that flash of light because it was subconscious. And so we have these pathways, two pathways dedicated to control and modulating, right? We need to acknowledge these types of things in the brain. It's super important, right? So very important. Okay, so that's my basal ganglia spill. Hope you liked it. Moving on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this hyperdirect pathway, right? And so when you start to see these things, cortical, subthalamal, palatal, hyperdirect pathway, don't freak out. Go back to the drawing. Cortical, subthalamic, palatal, no big deal. Just remember your drawing. They're just trying to confuse you with fancy words. Cortical, subthalamal, palatal. The cool thing here is that now that you know the drawing, you can say these things too, and people think you're making stuff up, and maybe you are, but you sound really smart. And so again, here's your a cool research study to look at. This is how they drew it. I think it's more confusing that way, but that's okay. This is really cool. Again, you have your indirect pathway giving rise to inhibition, your hyperdirect pathway giving rise to inhibition, and your direct pathway disinhibit, you know what I'm talking about, making you move. Cool. All right, so here we go. The cortical, subthalamal, palatal, hyperdirect pathway conveys powerful excitatory effects from the motor-related cortical areas to the globus pallidus, bypassing the striatum with shorter conduction time than effects conveyed through the striatum. All right, so let's go back to this. So we're bypassing the striatum. Why is that important? What did I tell you earlier? The substantia nigra pars compacta feeds dopamine into the striatum. All right, so it feeds dopamine here. So we're bypassing the striatum because the cortex is saying, hey, dummy, you're addicted to the dopamine. So I have to create a way around your dopamine addictions because you're killing yourself. And so I'm going to figure this out otherwise. And it's coming from these newer parts of my brain. You see how important it is to inhibit ourselves. Our brain knows we're going to screw up. Our brain knows we're going to seek things that generate dopamine, and we have to find a way around it. I just think that's so cool to think through. All right. So